Right-wing conspiracy theorists often assume that the European Union is a leftist or even a communist project. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. The European Union, or the EU, is an imperialist free trade organization that serves the interests of the biggest multinational corporations, banks and capitalists, and capitalist countries in Europe. And this is why us communists oppose it. The EU serves the interests of the most wealthy. First, we have to briefly discuss the Marxist-Leninist understanding of imperialism. Imperialism is sometimes simplified to mean simple military conquest, the building of an empire. But in the Marxist-Leninist understanding of the word, it means much more than that. Imperialism means taking over another country's natural resources, utilizing their cheap labor, and taking over their markets. Notice that all of these actions are political and economic, not military. Imperialism requires military actions and violence only when it cannot achieve these things in any other way. Military conquest is not the point, it is only a means to an end. The goal is economic exploitation. Military actions merely facilitate this exploitation. The Western imperialist countries own most of the world's wealth today. They exploit cheap third-world labor, dig minerals and oil from poor countries at very low prices, and dominate the global markets. This is imperialism. Although imperialism itself is economic activity, obviously many imperialist countries still do engage in constant imperialist war to further their economic interests, most notably the United States, but also the UK, France, Germany, and many others. Imperialism, or imperialist capitalism, is the modern stage of capitalism, global capitalism. Lenin defined 5 basic features of modern imperialist capitalism. They can be summed up as follows. 1. Capital has concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, so that monopolies, large corporations, and multinationals play a decisive role in the economy. 2. Creation of modern finance capital, which holds even more power than industry. 3. Export of capital, which means export of production, export of investment, export of jobs, has become more important than the export of goods and commodities. Instead of merely selling products to poor countries, the Western imperialist powers have increasingly shifted to also moving jobs, production itself, to poor countries. Manufacturing, mining, and other production is more and more being moved to these neo-colonies. 4. Formation of international monopolist capitalist associations, which share the world among themselves. 5. The entire world has been divided up between the biggest capitalist imperialist powers. This is what Lenin says. Quote, Imperialism is capitalism at that stage of development at which the dominance of monopolies and finance capital is established, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world among the international trusts has begun, in which the division of all territories of the globe among the biggest capitalist powers has been completed. End of quote. So what does this have to do with the EU? Lenin points out the formation of international capitalist associations. This is exactly what the EU is. There are others, such as the IMF, NATO, and the various precursors of the EU, like the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, and the European Economic Community, EEC. The EU was created on one hand as a natural development of European capitalism and imperialism, also to consolidate the power of capitalism after the defeat of the Soviet bloc, and also to create a market area powerful enough to compete against the USA, China, and Russia. Just like Lenin said, the world has been divided into large capitalist associations that sometimes have common interests, but are also rivals. Imperialism is when a capitalist country exploits and controls the markets, resources, and labor of other countries. In the EU, the leading imperialist powers of Europe hold most of the power and can dictate the policy of other smaller countries. The European Union limits the sovereignty of its member countries, with the exception of the biggest imperialist powers themselves, who have the greatest power in deciding the EU's line. Member states of the EU cannot control their borders. The free movement of labor power is one of the founding principles of the EU. This means that the corporations of wealthier countries can freely exploit vast amounts of cheap immigrant labor. Right-wing nationalists might oppose immigration, but they fail to see why mass immigration happens. It happens because imperialism impoverishes and exploits poorer countries, causing people to want to move elsewhere. The EU then facilitates this with relatively open borders and ease of movement from country to country. The EU does this because it is in the economic interests of the big capitalist corporations. Massive uncontrolled immigration is a problem. It is always a problem when huge amounts of people feel like they cannot live in their home country anymore. But the solution is not to attack the immigrants. That will not do anything to fix the problem. The only real solution to this problem is to stop the imperialist plundering and exploitation of poor countries, and for countries to achieve real sovereignty. In other words, to put an end to the global capitalist system. Marxists are not against immigration in principle, because we want cooperation and friendship between all nations and all peoples. But the current immigration caused by capitalism is not good and should not be defended, because it is based on exploitation. Member states of the EU cannot regulate their own economies. We Marxists want to control prices to ensure necessary goods are affordable for all citizens. We want to provide cheap housing. We want to provide free education and health care. We want to subsidize public transport. All these policies have been practiced in this country, and they've been very popular and successful, but all of them are now impossible in the European Union. Finland used to control the amount of money that could be invested into this country. Finland also used to be able to control how much money was taken out of this country. But in the EU, we no longer control either one of these. Foreign corporations are now free to invest in this country as much as they like. For instance, in mining. They dig our minerals, they pollute our environment, and then they take the money and put it to tax havens. This is imperialism. Even though Finland itself is a Western capitalist country that exploits cheap labor in India, Bangladesh, and elsewhere, participates in military drills with NATO, and is itself an imperialist country, it is also at the same time exploited by wealthier European imperialists. The pro-EU parties in European governments are servants of imperialism. In Finland, all the major parliamentary parties support the European Union. They get large amounts of money from the EU, and their politicians go back and forth between holding jobs in the European Parliament, other EU bodies, and the Finnish government. In Marxist-Leninist terminology, this is called comprador capitalism. A comprador capitalist is someone who serves the interest of a foreign government instead of their own national interest. In other words, a puppet of imperialism. Compradors sell their own country to international imperialism, and as payment, the imperialists take care of them. These puppet leaders ensure that Finland stays in the EU and executes EU policy, such as the continuing privatization of state property, deregulation of our economy, and the further opening of our markets for multinational corporations. Right-wing populist and nationalist parties are almost entirely worthless in opposing the European Union. They do not acknowledge or even understand the real nature of the EU. They spend all their time attacking helpless immigrants or refugees who have no power or control over anything. This doesn't challenge the EU in any way and only serves as a distraction from the real causes of our situation. Some of these nationalist parties participate in the European Parliament and receive funding from the EU itself. For this reason, they become more moderate. The EU becomes their employer, and suddenly they don't even want to leave it anymore. The Finns party is a classic example of this. These parties go from being anti-EU to being Eurosceptics, or even soft Eurosceptics. What does it even mean to be a Eurosceptic? I'm not skeptical of the European Union. I'm against the European Union. These parties talk about reforming the EU, improving the EU, or making a better EU. But they seem to forget that we don't want a better EU, we want to leave the EU. The EU is imperialist. Its very founding principles of free movement of labor power, free movement of money, free movement of investments, and opening of markets are inherently imperialist capitalist. Quote, "The Union ensures free movement of persons, services, goods, and capital." End of quote. These principles can never be reformed to be anything good or beneficial for us. They are the principles of an imperialist free trade organization. This is not an organization of cooperation or friendship, it is an organization of exploitation and thievery. Participation in the Euro Parliament elections is a tactical question. In some countries, voting in these elections is mandatory, and some parties might have special reasons for wanting to participate, but generally it is useless to participate in the Euro Parliament. In fact, it is harmful, as it legitimizes the EU. Participating in these sham elections is basically spreading the lie that the Euro Parliament is a democracy where people can actually change things. This is not the case. The biggest member countries control the EU, and it cannot ever be reformed to be anything other than imperialist. Furthermore, since we want to leave the EU, there is no point in trying to reform it. Leaving the EU is something the government of a member country can do regardless of the Euro Parliament. It doesn't involve the Euro Parliament in any way. It would be most useful to boycott the Euro Parliament, and to try to get in or influence the national government instead. This would be an anti-imperialist action on the one hand, but leaving the EU is also a necessary prerequisite for democracy, economic planning, and socialism.